Welcome to Long Story Short, a series where big historical events and themes are explained in a concise way that does not sacrifice facts or analysis. In today's episode, in honour of Pride Month, we're going to be recounting the events of the Stonewall Riot, one of the landmarks in LGBTQ+ history and the fight for the community's rights. In order to fully understand Stonewall, we must first examine the context which the uprising was born from. In the late 1950s and 1960s, the LGBTQ+ community was still very much a marginalised group, especially in the US. Not only did the community face legal restrictions on their behaviour and presentation, queer people also were socially ostracised and discriminated against. Homosexuality and gender nonconformity was seen as a mental illness, and queer people disproportionately experienced homelessness, violence, police brutality and suicide. This happened all in the context of the Cold War and moral panic, in which Western authorities persecuted communists, leftists, and other types of people who did not conform, which culminated in events such as the Lavender Scare, in which queer people were dismissed en masse from the government. This overall hostility and lack of civil protection meant that queer people found communities in covert spaces, most often in underground bars and clubs. One of these bars was the Stonewall Inn, which was opened on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village, New York, by the son of a mafia boss in the late 1960s. However, these spaces were frequently targeted by the police, which led queer people to clash with them. Other riots predated Stonewall, such as the Compton Cafeteria Riot of 1966 and the Black Cat Tavern protests of the following year. Thus, Stonewall was born out of this context of not just discrimination but of growing resistance. The events of Stonewall transpired on the 27th of June 1969 and into the early hours of the next day, in which the Stonewall Inn was raided by the New York police to target both the mafia which run it as well as the clientele of the bar. The police entered the bar in the early hours of the morning and began to attempt to forcibly remove everybody, to subject them to ID checks and arrests, especially those who did not conform to expected ideas of gender and expression. Instead of complying to the police brutality they were faced with, the people of Stonewall Inn fought back. Accounts are conflicting about how the riot started, or what individual exactly sparked collective action. Some reports, for example, state that the action was started inside the bar, when a shot glass was thrown at police officers. Others state that bricks were thrown outside the bar in response to the arrest of Stormy DeLavier. Nevertheless, an uprising broke out against the police, with around 100 to 500 participants who threw projectiles at them as well as chanting and singing. At the heart of these protests were figures such as Stormy DeLavier, as well as activists like Martha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. The police eventually barricaded themselves in the Stonewall Inn to wait for reinforcements. The police reinforcements that arrived attempted to disperse the crowds. However, for days, greater numbers of people continued to gather to protest against the targeting of queer spaces by the police, with some reports stating that the demonstrations continued onto the Wednesday evening. This marks the increasing presence that the community was forging for itself in wider society. Or as Michael Fader states, "Everybody in the crowd felt like we were never going to go back. It was the last straw. It was time to reclaim something that had always been taken from us." Stonewall as an event was not isolated. It was indeed indicative of wider changes that took place in the fight for LGBTQ rights that occurred in the 1960s. As Betty Luther Hillman notes, over this period, the more conventional and conformist homophile movements of the 1950s were transformed into a louder and more militant gay liberation movement that utilised more radical action and politics, such as gender nonconformity in drag. Stonewall is a vital event in LGBTQ+ history, because after Stonewall, the community began to be shaped into what it is now recognised as a group with a shared identity and protest agenda. For instance, right after the riot in July, the Gay Liberation Front was formed to mobilise the fight for queer rights across the United States and eventually around the globe, with branches set up in the UK, for example. Annually, Pride demonstrations were held around the globe to celebrate the LGBTQ+ community, commemorate the events of Stonewall, and to continue to fight for change and equality. However, what makes Stonewall so important was the profound and long-term effects that the event had not only on the LGBTQ+ community, but on wider society. Stonewall highlights how radical and grassroots action from the most marginalised in society was used to create change and demand a public voice in the face of oppression and forcible attempts at being silenced. For resources on LGBTQ+ history, look in the description for more information. I wish you all a safe and happy Pride. Thank you so much for watching. I have been Our Historia, and until next time.